All right, so there were really good scores on the test. So you guys did really well. Um,
And you tell us
I'll,
how to roll.
I will go through and look at the math questions, and then the team is going to meet this week. So the final test grades will either be posted Friday evening or Saturday morning. Most likely Friday evening, but just give Saturday as a fallback. Any questions?
Yeah. So the score that popped up when we got done, what was that?
That's the preliminary score before review.
Oh,
So we haven't reviewed the test. Test will be reviewed this week. And then we'll move forward from
And that
there.
includes the math questions as well in that predictor score?
It does, but you got to remember, like, if, it wasn't entered exactly the way they put it in there, excuse me, then it'll mark it incorrect. So I will, multitasking. But yes, so then I'll review the math and then the team will review the other questions. But like I said, there were some really great scores. So y'all should be really proud of yourselves. All right. So for week 4, so for this week, we are talking about ethics, and the laws, I guess. Let me pull this up. So it is chapter 6 and chapter 7. I know you guys were busy studying for your test. Does anybody have a chance to review these chapters at all? All right. So chapter 6 is ethics applied to nursing practice. So personal versus professional ethics. And I will share my screen so you have a visual. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Yes. All right, there's a couple people that need to be let back in still. All right, so ethics. I know everybody has heard this term before. Ethics is a system of standards or moral principles that direct actions as either being right or wrong, right? It's concerned with the meaning of words such as right, wrong, good, bad, ought to, duty. And, it's kind of, either individually or as a group, right? What we consider right or wrong. Do we have the duty to do something, the right to do something? Or, should we do something, right? And so personal ethics provide personal guidelines for living. You, right, choose ultimately what your personal code of ethics includes, and your personal code of ethics, what you believe is right or wrong, right, can also influence your nursing ethics. And there are times that your personal ethics may conflict with the law, which in our case would be the Nurse Practice Act. Other terms too, we have morals, right? Morals are concerned with dealing with right or wrong behavior. That's our conduct as well as our character. And then values involve the worth you assign to an idea or action, right? And these are freely chosen. They are affected by our age, our experience, our maturity, right? And think about whatever age you are now, what the values that you had when you were younger may be a little bit different than the values that you have as you get older, right? As we gain new knowledge, new experiences, right? Our values can shift. We know that the Nurse Practice Act is, in our state, whatever state that you're in, that is your authority. That's your final authority on what you are legally obligated to do as a nurse, regardless of where you are employed, right? So make sure, everybody has gone through their Nurse Practice Act and looked at their Nurse Practice Act, but sorry, I'm like rolling my mouth. Be very aware of what your Nurse Practice Act says that you can and what you cannot do. That is extremely important, because even your employer cannot override what that Nurse Practice Act says. I don't know, my mouse is acting crazy. I apologize. I don't know why. We have the Western secular belief system. This is where the emphasis is shifted from duties to the rights of the individual. So within that, we have what's called individual autonomy as well as individual rights. So individual autonomy, 1 second. Means self-rule, right? You have the capacity to think, and then based on those thoughts to make whatever decision. So you make the decision freely, whether you want to seek healthcare, right? You have that freedom to choose. Individual rights are the ability to assert one's rights. The extent to which a client can exert his or her rights is restricted, right? To a certain degree, right? They can't violate the rights of others. They can, however, refuse treatment, right? That sometimes comes in to odds with, our perceived duty. Right? We know that we're trying to help them and they're refusing our services. The individual's right is a central theme of healthcare. They have the right to consent to care. They have the right to choose between alternative treatments. They have the right to consent or refuse treatment. And then, of course, women's rights over their bodies is another big one. Has anybody ever come across a patient in, either in clinical or where you're working now that has refused treatment from nurses, staff? No. So it is something that happens, for whatever reason, whether it's a lack of trust, just, not wanting a particular treatment. It could just be a misunderstanding of the benefits versus the negative effects of the treatment. And this is where, right, education can't always change their mind, but we're going to provide them the education needed in order to make that informed decision. Ethical responsibilities of nurses. Client advocacy. What does it mean to be an advocate?
To be like a voice for those who don't have a voice for themselves.
Perfect definition. Be a voice for those that don't have a voice for themselves, right? Doctor orders the wrong medication, the incorrect dose. What do? Do we give that medication? No, right? What do we do?
We contact the doctor.
Right, we contact the doctor and we say, hey, Dr. Jones, think this is the wrong medication, think this is the wrong dose of medication, it's being a voice for our patients. Uh, we're going to see patients on their worst days. We're going to see patients on their best days, right? And so they are usually in some sort of a vulnerable state. And that is where we need to step in. What does it mean to be accountable?
Doing what you say you're gonna do.
Right. So you're answerable, right? You're answerable to yourself, to your patients, to your patient's family, to the, your other fellow nurses, your supervisors, right? And so you are, get out there into the nursing world, you are going to be held accountable for the actions that you perform, or that you are assigned to perform. Colleague reporting. So this is probably one of the more difficult things that we are responsible for. This is reporting your peers, your supervisors, or any other team members for behaviors that are potentially harmful to clients. So if you have a fellow nurse that appears intoxicated, is stealing clients' medication, not giving the right medications, substituting medications, really not paying attention to their patients, sleeping on duty, verbal, physical abuse. We as nurses are responsible to report that. I hope that you never have to be in a situation where you have to do that. But understand that it is something that is a problem in some areas of nursing. I've had nurses sleep on duty. During COVID, we had a nurse. We weren't accepting a whole lot of new patients at the time. And so we hadn't lost any patients. So none of our patients had passed away. We did a really good job at keeping COVID out of the building. But we had a nurse, there was an empty bed empty room that was right next to the nurse's station. And she didn't know that the cameras in the building were still functional. And she would go into the room. She had a jerry lounger. She had the bedside table all set up, pillows, blankets, the remote control, everything. And she would literally just sit there and sleep her shift away. Not realizing that she was caught on camera. Unfortunately, I've had coworkers, prior coworkers, that have been caught taking narcotics and taking them for themselves. In another case, it wasn't for themselves, it was for their spouse. So there are situations that you may come across in your nursing career. It's not an easy situation, but the biggest thing that we have to worry about is our patient safety, right? We cannot have an impaired nurse taking care of sick patients that are particularly vulnerable, because there can have some negative outcomes. You as well, if you know of a situation and don't report it, may also get in trouble for that. So just be aware that that can happen. System-based issues. So when we look at systems-based issues, these are things that we identify, good or bad, that is essential to providing safe, high quality care to our patients. So think of, especially in hospitals where things are always changing. Maybe most hospitals are really good about this, but, just maybe they've got, a new glucometer, a new, IV start kit, new IV needles, that they put out once a unit. And people haven't been fully trained on those, right? That could be a potential system-based issue. If you don't know how to use the equipment correctly, right, that could cause patient harm. And so that is something to look at as well. Identifying any system-based issues that may be, right? What about, talk about evidence-based practice, right? What if, you're reading an article one day and you're like, oh, this hospital is doing this and, they're having really good results. What if we did that here in ours? And there's a way to bring that to your chain of command to implement changes for the better. The other principles of ethics, and I know that you've heard these before, non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, fidelity, and justice, right? So non-maleficence, we know, right, do no harm. And so what are some things that we do as nurses in our practice to ensure that we are not doing harm to our patients?
Med checks or med rights?
The 9 rights of medication administration, right? Perfect. What else? You're getting ready to leave a patient's room after performing a procedure. What are some checks that you do before you leave that room? What about if you're in a hospital, making sure the bed rails are up, the bed is in the lowest position, they have their call bell, right? Their bedside table is within reach with their water, their drinks, their remote control, those kinds of things, right? Those are all part of non-maleficence. Beneficence means to do good. And so this is the basis of trust in nursing. So it also is preventing harm, it is removing harm. And so when we are putting our clients' interests or our patients' interests first, right? So it's just like, you don't leave the unit until you give report to the oncoming shift. If you make an error, that you are checking your client first, right? You're reporting the error. Going to work even though you really don't want to, right? Not just calling out sick. But again, we're putting the client's needs before your needs. And it's not calling out sick because you're sick, right? It's calling out sick because you just don't want to go to work, right? There's a difference. If you're sick, stay home, right? But how many of us have woken up in the morning and going, I really don't want to go to work today. I should just call in sick. I've done that. I've wanted to, right? No, just only a couple. Y'all are great. But a lot of times, right? There's things, but we try to put the client's needs first. Autonomy is the freedom to choose, right? It doesn't mean that they can, do whatever they want, right? They can't violate the rights of others, but they can think through all the facts, they can decide what to do, they can act based on personal decision. They are making that decision without pressure from anyone else. And then we have fidelity. What does it mean to be, what does it mean? What does fidelity mean? Sorry.
Loyal.
Loyal. Loyal, right? So when we are loyal to our patients, what does that mean?
To be honest,
Okay. Honest, faithful, right? Making sure that we are, doing appropriate charting, that we are providing education, providing as much information as possible, to our patients. It, not talking about negatively about our patients. And then justice. Justice is fair to all. So it's fair and equal treatment to all of your patients, right? So do we really do the same thing for every one of our patients? No, because they all have very different needs, right? And so you are going to provide fair care, just care to every single one of your patients, avoiding any bias that you may have. Excuse me. And that's kind of one of the things that we have to try to avoid is bias. And we've talked about bias before, right? And so putting aside your personal thoughts and providing that just care to everyone. Is everybody going to be happy 100% of the time?
No.
No. Who's worked in long-term care or done a clinical in long-term care? Everybody's done at least one clinical in a long-term care setting, right? Have you ever had, oops, sorry, I keep hitting my mouse. I need to get my hand off of it. Have you ever walked in most long-term care facilities that I've worked in, there's two to a room, right? Where one of the residents needs a little bit more attention just because of their condition, and the other resident doesn't quite need as much attention, but gets super needy because all the attention is given to her roommate. Has anybody come across that? Right? Those can be some difficult situations, right? Where you're like, oh my goodness, what do I do? Right? And it's kind of like they both have different needs, and each of their needs to be fulfilled, but just in a different way. And so that it can be a little difficult in some situations. Fortunately, in hospitals, right, the majority of your patients are in private rooms, so you very rarely will have at least not have that situation. Another term we have here is called beneficent can't even say the word, beneficent paternalism. And this is a disrespectful attitude toward the client and what the client has to contribute to personal care and recovery. It's one of those like, I know what's best for you. And it completely discounts the client's knowledge, right? We don't know what's best in most cases for the client. They know what the extent of their limits are, right? In emergency situations, then this would be, something that would be beneficial. And so, of course, this one, it can be used for good in emergent situations such as obtaining a court order to save the life of a child against parents' wishes. Has anybody read any of those cases about where hospitals have had to override the parents and provide care? there's some interesting cases out there regarding those situations. A lot of times, well, some of the times it's a lack of education. I have seen even in certain cases where they have, certain religious or spiritual beliefs that interfere with the care of the child, where they have refused life-saving treatments. And I say life-saving, like literal life-saving treatments, because of their, certain beliefs. And so hospitals will go and they'll get court orders, in order to help that child. And so that brings us into chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a little bit hefty when it comes to the terms and things like that. So what is accountability? Tell me what accountability is.
Accountability is taking ownership of your actions.
Okay, taking ownership of your actions. Absolutely, right? If you do something, claim it, right? Basically is what that means. What are advanced directives? Does anybody have advanced directives yet?
An order put in place for like if you're unable to make decisions for yourself.
Right. So you're healthy, perfectly healthy. And so these are legal documents, right, that allow us to specify, there are wishes regarding future medical care when, we can't communicate for ourselves or, can't communicate our own preferences. These are advanced directives, don't necessarily assign anybody as like a proxy or anything like that. This is saying that, let's say, somebody got into a car accident and, they were declared brain dead, or they don't want to have any, they don't want to stay on life support, things like that, or even when we look at, do you want IV fluids? Do you want oxygen? What kind? You can be very specific with the type of care that you want with advanced directions. We'll talk about assault, talk about battery. Tell me about confidentiality.
Keeping private information or personal information private.
Right. So when we are, at clinical, when we're at work, it's, we don't talk about our patients in the cafeteria. We don't talk about them in the hallway. We don't talk about them in the elevators. We, be very careful, even, if you're not identifying them via name by name. Even certain diagnoses, different identifying factors can be overheard, and don't ever want to put yourself in that situation. We'll talk about defamation, informed consent. All right, so we'll talk about the rest of these as we go forward. All right, so Nurse Practice Act. So that defines your nursing practice. It establishes the standards for nurses in your state. Saying that you didn't know is never a good defense. And everybody did that assignment about the Nurse Practice Act. Were you guys surprised by anything that you saw when you went through your Nurse Practice Act? No. there are a lot of similarities across states. And that is, one of the things that was pretty nice when they came out with those the compact states, right? So that, you got your license in, Georgia, and, you want to move to another compact state. In some cases, there just may be a little bit more like, education that you may have to do in order to transfer your license, but a lot of times it is reciprocal. You will still have to you will still have to know what the Nurse Practice Act says. So like for me, when I moved from Virginia to Texas, my license was reciprocated, but I did have to take a jurisprudence exam. And so they give you all the information that you need. You have to take the exam, you have to pass the exam in order to get your license, and you still have to do the fingerprinting, the background checking. Like in New York, there is some child abuse education that has to be taken in order to get your license. So it may be additional things that you need to do, but not usually like a formal education. We look at that Nurse Practice Act, right? The general rules and regulations of each state will, identify what the functions of the State Board of Nursing is, what the general procedures are. So like how much does it cost for you to apply for a license, get your license, what the process is for the license, what would be considered unprofessional conduct, information related to reasons for suspended or revoked licenses, as well as impaired professional program. Has anybody ever gone on to your State Board of Nursing and looked at some of the reasons why nurses have either had their license revoked, suspended, reprimanded? Nobody has ever done that. So once you get your license, it is public record. And so you can go to your nurse or to your State Board of Nursing website, and you can look up case decisions, and any of the boards that is regulated by that entity. So you can look to see why nurses, lost their license or were reprimanded. So it just depends on what state you're in. So, what you can look up. But you would be amazed at how many nurses have gotten their licenses suspended for misdirection of medication. It is very shocking. The Nurse Practice Act also, right, it's going to give us what we can and cannot do as a LPN or LVN as a registered nurse. It will define nurses. It'll also provide for the standards of nursing conduct, as well as, the organization approval of nursing programs, as well as continuing education. So how many CEUs you have to do per year in order to renew your nursing license every 2 years. The impaired professional programs. So this is for nurses that may have either a drug, alcohol addiction, some other type of issue, where they actually have monitoring programs that are offered through the Board of Nursing to help get them into recovery. Their licenses usually are suspended while they are going through the program, but we're participating in those programs, generally assist them in getting their licenses back. So that is something that is available in most boards of nursing. Talked about this. Some of the common functions of the board, licensing and certifying, nurses, CNAs, setting the fees. Talked about the standards for educational programs, approving schools of nursing, determining the duration and renewal of licenses. Again, some boards do require continuing education. Actually, most boards do require some sort of continuing education for renewal of license. Maintains inactive status lists, does the disciplinary action, the programs for the impaired nurses, as well as suspending and revoking licenses, dealing with the appeal process. I don't know about y'all, but I don't ever want to have to be in front of the board of nursing. It's not on my list of things that I want to do. And so the disciplinary responsibility of the board, remember that the board is there to protect the public, right? And so depending on, what happens. So some of the, things like unprofessional conduct, boundary issues, practicing while impaired, violating confidentiality, failure to supervise those that you've delegated responsibilities to, inaccurate recording, falsifying or altering a client or healthcare provider record, sexual misconduct. There's a variety of things that can cause someone to go in front of the Board of Nursing. And so some of the penalties that the Board of Nursing will bring down, they could do fine or civil penalty. They can refer to an alternative to discipline program. They can do a public reprimand or censure. They can imposition of requirements for monitoring, remediation, education, or other provision tailored to the particular situation. So I'll just use, I have an example for that. And there was a nurse who got reprimanded for providing a fake doctor's note. So they had called out sick, brought in a fake note, got caught, was reported to the Board of Nursing. So license didn't get suspended, anything like that. The nurse got reprimanded, and then had to continue, had to do some continuing education. I forget on integrity, or I forget what what it all said. But a lot of times the education is going to be related to whatever whatever the violation is. They also could limit or restrict aspects of practice. So when we talk about some of our impaired nurses that have diverted narcotics as contingent of getting their license back, they may not be able to work with narcotics, right? That means somebody else would have to pull their narcotics for them, give their narcotics for them. Usually they'll have to have somebody that's responsible for direct oversight of that nurse. Not that there isn't always, but a little bit more direct oversight. So it could just, be something like that. And then of course they could suspend, or they could revoke, or the nurse could voluntarily surrender their license. Again, remediation, education, and then, depending on what state there is, there may be something that's more state specific in that case. When we look at violations of the Nurse Practice Act, some of your states may list specific violations. So this really kind of, it depends. And so, like I said, my goal is to not ever be in front of the Board of Nursing. And so just act with, prudence when you're providing your nursing care. Because I know for a fact that you guys have worked very hard in order to get this far in the program and to continue, right, to get your NCLEX and to go out and practice. So just, that's the best thing I can say is just go out there and be very prudent with what you are, the care that you are providing to your patients. When we look at unprofessional conduct isn't something that, anybody really aspires to do, but negligence is one. The nurse does not do what a reasonable, prudent nurse would do in a similar situation. This can include serious risks to the health, safety, or physical or mental health of a client. Your talked about the violation, incompetence. Examples include failure to meet generally accepted standards of nursing practice, negligence, and a nurse's mental disability that would interfere with client safety. Unethical conduct, breach of nurse-client confidentiality. It's probably one of the biggest things that we would have, we have to worry about as well. I don't see as much of this, but I guess it could happen. Refusal to provide nursing care for someone because of race, creed, color, national origin, disease, or sexual orientation. Violation of the ethical code for nurses, as well as failure to maintain nursing competence. And then, of course, your alcohol or your drug abuse. So, disciplinary process. Again, hope none of us ever have to be there. I will go and be a witness for somebody, but I don't ever want to have to be the one standing in front of the board of nursing. So a nurse is reported for stealing the client's narcotics to the State Board of Nursing. So after receiving the complaint, determining that a chemical has affected the nurse's judgment, renders them unsafe to practice, confirms that the stolen narcotics are a violation of the Nurse Practice Act as well as the law, the board will review the complaint. All right, so they have to do a review before they, just automatically file a complaint. They'll investigate. So they will question witnesses, they'll gather evidence. It's a full-blown investigation. The nurse does, or the nurse, whoever, the defendant is in the situation, does have the opportunity to respond to the allegations during the board proceedings. Lawyers can be present. A nurse can have a lawyer present. And then the board action follows the board proceedings, and that's where they'll determine the disciplinary action. So I've actually been I've had calls where I've had to talk to the investigators about other nurses. In some cases, just be very honest and open about what the situation is. Like the last one I got was when I was working in long-term care. I don't know even who reported the nurse, but they were doing an investigation for, oh my gosh, what is it called? Oh my gosh. She clocked in, accepted the assignment, counted the drawer, and then walked out of the building. Abandonment, sorry, I don't think of the word. And so they called me because apparently I was there and had to get on the cart for her that day, but I didn't remember the situation. I just remember going into work and they were like, we don't have another nurse to work the cart in. I was in management, but I was like, okay, I'll just get on the cart. I didn't know the situation leading up to that. So when the board of nursing called, I was like, I At that facility, I spent more time on the cart than I did doing my administrative job. So I was like, I don't remember that happening. Not to say that it didn't happen. I said, but I can't give you information and tell you that, something happened if it didn't happen. So, just I was, completely honest. I don't even remember the nurse actually, which is probably even worse. But then they're the ones that are going to, like I said, they're going to be the ones that are going to determine. So I'm going to show you. I'm just going to pull up, let's see. I'm going to kind of show you what it looks like. And I'm just pulling up, like I said, this is all, what do you call it? It's all public records. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to share a different screen. So this is from the Virginia Board of Nursing only because I know how to get around this Board of Nursing website. But so this one is the recommendation. So it stated that the nurse was there. She was not represented by legal counseling. So basically it's going to tell us what it is. So she's unsafe due to physical or mental illness or substance abuse. And then it's going to literally list all the different things that has happened, right? So this one's a pretty long list. You can see this is I didn't look at it, but I think this was substance abuse as well. Regardless, I'm not going to read all through that, but then this will be the order. So they are suspending her license, as well as any other compact state. And then, if she does enter into that monitoring program to assist with her abuse, then she could potentially get her license reinstated. So that's kind of what it would look like. But initially what'll happen is they'll send you a letter or they'll call you and kind of tell you, what's going on. And if any of the accusations, I guess I hate that word, but any of the accusations are substantiated during their interviews and their investigation, that is when it'll go to the board and that's what they will get. There's been plenty of situations where things have gone to the Board of Nursing and during the process of their investigation, they have not found anything. And so that it may still show that there was something initially on their license, but there won't be any documentation. And so just kind of, and with that, we have reporting and enforcing. I'm sorry, I will reshare my screen. Have you guys heard of NURSYS before? NURSYS. So NURSYS is a national database for verifying license, discipline, and action privileges for nurses. And so it's different from the State Board of Nursing, right? So for example, for the State Board of Nursing, it's only going to cover nurses that their home state is your state. So, if my home state was Virginia, Florida, wherever it is. NURSYS is national. All right. So it's kind of like you go to DMV and they kind of know if you got in trouble in another state. This is what NURSYS is. So it monitors licenses across these states. And so it'll give them the nurse's license, the license number, the date of the license expiration, any violations associated with that license. And there's also a national practitioner data bank. So that is another one that can be used to look up other types of providers. Concepts to consider. There are temporary license. Um, so when you, and I think Virginia recently changed it. It was something that I noticed before I left Virginia. It used to be 90 days, so you graduated and you can work as a student practical nurse for 90 days while you're waiting to take your NCLEX. But I think they shortened it. I think it's like 60 days now or 45 days. I haven't looked in a while, so I could be wrong about that. But that's a temporary permit to work, right? And if you know, you have to pass your NCLEX in order to keep working. If you are unsuccessful with your NCLEX, right, then you can no longer work as a graduate nurse until you pass your NCLEX. Then unlicensed assistant personnel, supervision is one of the biggest concerns. So as LPNs, you will delegate to CNAs, to care partners, make sure, a lot of times we get busy. We may forget. But anytime you delegate a responsibility or delegate an action, it is your responsibility to make sure that that action is done appropriately, correctly. And so follow-up is absolutely necessary. So nursing standards of care. Again, that's just a guideline for us, right? That's our guideline for good nursing care. You are held to a high standard. Florence Nightingale worked very hard for, us as nurses to be recognized as a profession. And so the standard is based on what an ordinary prudent nurse with similar education and nursing experience would do in similar circumstances. And this is, again, it's all kind of your resources. Is your Nurse Practice Act, NCLEX tests minimum competence. All right. So you take your NCLEX, you have that knowledge, right? But it's minimum. They can't test you on every possible scenario that would happen in nursing. Your organizational policies and procedures, law, all of those are there to help you to identify what the standards of care are. Criminal versus civil action. And so again, nobody wants to ever be in this. Criminal is government against an individual. And these are usually be felony or misdemeanor charges. So a misdemeanor is the least serious charge, right? Can still get a prison sentence, still can get, a pretty hefty fine. But, this is just, it's a little bit less. Whereas a felony is a more serious offense, usually ranges from more than 1 year in prison to death. And so, your homicide, embezzlement, larceny. Anybody watched the show or read the book, The Good Nurse? Nobody? When you get out of nursing school and you have a little bit more free time, either read the book or I haven't watched the show. I just know that there is one. It's about a nurse that thought
The movie, right?
yeah. Did
The
you watch
movie,
it?
I watched it with this. It's a true story, The Color Law.
It is. The
Yep.
It is a true story. I
Mhm.
actually, one of my friends was actually worked at the same hospital that he was at. And so he killed quite a few patients. Called him thought he was the angel of death or something. Whereas your civil action, this is an individual versus individual. And so, this could be just, an infringement on individual rights, usually results in some sort of a monetary compensation. So I'm trying to think, it's usually going to be some sort of a payment that is going to occur. So we have intentional torts and unintentional torts. Intentional tort is intended to cause harm to the client. So either threaten the client or actually cause physical harm to the client. Whereas an unintentional tort is, didn't mean to hurt the client, right? But they still were injured. I had jury duty last year or the year before. No, it was probably last year or the year before. I can't remember. And one of the trials that I was interviewing for was actually a malpractice where the client or the person was suing their orthopedic doctor, saying that I think they had a shoulder replacement, saying that they used the wrong size shoulder and it's causing her more issues. And rather than, going back and getting it fixed, because she was scared now to go back to the provider. So it was a whole big thing. I didn't get chose. I really wanted to sit on that trial because I was really curious about how that one was going to play out. But then even when I looked on the court website, I couldn't even find it. So I thought, I'm like, maybe they decided to settle out of court and it didn't even go to trial. So, but your intentional torts could include assault and battery. So what's the difference between assault and battery? Personally, I always get these mixed up myself.
Isn't battery like the actual physical, then assault's just like a threat?
Yeah. So the assault is, the threat to tell somebody, whereas the battery is the physical assault or a physical harm on somebody. I always got them backwards. Still, sometimes I have to stop and think about it. So again, assault is the threat and battery is the actual action of harming somebody. Treating a client without consent is considered battery. So we do have to be careful with that, even if it's medically beneficial, right? So you have to be very careful when we're doing certain things like that. Somebody go in and put a Foley catheter in and they say, no, I don't want the Foley catheter, and you do it anyway, right? You could get into trouble for that. False imprisonment and use of restraints. False imprisonment is keeping somebody against their will, right? It's, blocking somebody from coming out of their room. It's using either physical or chemical restraints, without orders, without cause. Trying to think, usually that's probably, or even if they decide that they are going to try to leave AMA and you are physically blocking them from leaving the building, that is false imprisonment. Defamation is damaging somebody's reputation through false communication or communication without their permission. And so libel is written and slander is verbal. So that's why, when you're documenting, only document the facts. You want to be very careful with, how you document, what you document. You don't want to write any, personal negative statements regarding your patients. And then again, to even verbalizing, don't really, yes, we all know patients can be a pain in the butt sometimes, and they don't always agree with what we are trying to do. But just be very careful with that. And then, of course, physical and emotional abuse. Physical abuse is generally easier to identify than emotional abuse is, right? Because usually there are some marks that are left behind. Don't do it. Negligence, talked a little bit about negligence before, right? Just the failure to provide reasonably prudent care. When we look at malpractice, professional negligence, malpractice is, it's negligence by a professional, right? So LPN, LVN, RN, MD, nurse practitioner, PA, whoever it is. The most common type of negligence in a practical nurse relates to action or lack of action, not what you intended to do. And that's where we have either acts of omission or acts of commission. Forgetting to give forgetting to give a medication would be an act of omission, or whereas giving the wrong medication would be an act of commission, right? So you did one versus you did not do the other. Some other causes of malpractice: medication errors, working while impaired, failure to follow standards of care, lack of observation and timely reporting, failure to use a medical device accurately, failure to communicate, failure to properly supervise, negligent delegation and supervision, failure to act as a client advocate, failure to get informed consent. So malpractice insurance. Anybody have malpractice insurance as a student? Yes. Okay. So why do you need it? The jury's award could exceed the limits of your agency's covered. So you are covered at your agency up to a certain amount. Your employing agency could pay out an award to a plaintiff and then countersue you. You acted outside the scope of employment and the agency is not liable, so they're going to put you out there on your own. Your employer's policy covers you only while you are on the job. And then an agency also might carry a policy that covers you only while you are employed by that institution. So I forget, statute of limitations are different for different things. So I'm not going to hazard a guess because I honestly don't know. I don't remember. But let's say, you worked for the, hospital A for 5 years, took care of a lot of different patients. You decided to leave because hospital B offered you a really good, pay increase, better hours, whatever. And a couple years later, you're not working for hospital A anymore, but your name comes up in a lawsuit because of something that happened at one of your patients, that was, at hospital A. And that malpractice insurance from hospital A might not still cover you because you don't work for them anymore. I can't remember, is it the American Nurses Association? I forget what it's called. Not that I forget the American Nurses Association, but I think it's the ANA. They actually have malpractice plans, offer discounts to students. 4 elements that are needed to prove a negligence: duty, breach of duty, damages, and proximate cause. So duty, right? That's the nurse's responsibility to provide care in an acceptable way. Breach of duty, you didn't adhere to the nursing standard of care. Damages are what the client must be able to show, that nurse's negligent act injured him or her in some way. So the client has to prove actual damage. And then proximate cause means that reasonable cause and effect relationship can be shown between the omission or the commission of the nursing act and harm to the client. Right, did that nurse's negligent act actually cause the harm to the client? So when we look the steps of negligence, oh, I already just said that, never mind. Steps for bringing legal action by a client, right? So the client believes that the nurse did something wrong, violated their rights, they're going to go to a lawyer. Then an attorney has an expert that, a nurse expert that is going to review the charts to see if that nurse had, violated any standards of care. And then if if it's determined that standard of care has been violated, then they will file a lawsuit. And then the client, or the defendant has the time to respond, then, usually what the defendant will get an attorney as well. They'll do depositions, discovery period. So they'll go in and they'll ask, talk to witnesses, experts, other caregivers. And then depending, they'll either go to trial or, in some cases they'll settle out of court. And then if they do go to trial, then the verdict will be rendered. And then, of course, they can appeal depending on, what the situation is. Privacy and confidentiality. So everybody knows about HIPAA. HIPAA's been around since the early 2000s, but there are times where information has to be revealed. Communicable diseases, right? Every health department has a list of reportable illnesses, right? That goes to the health department. STIs, measles, mumps, chickenpox, salmonella, the list goes on, right? Vaccine-related adverse reactions. These are sent also to the Department of Health. There is also another agency that we can report to that's specific to vaccines, criminal acts. So just, if certain criminal acts are always reported, if there's, clear and present danger, if there's, what would that be? Client misconduct, professional misconduct, that gets reported immediately to the supervisor. Or if it's an absolute emergency, you're going to follow whatever that emergency action plan is. And of course, child or adult abuse, or neglect, right? That absolutely has to be reported. There is no confidentiality that is expected in those situations. The other one is going to be as well, incompetence, or unprofessional acts from coworkers, right? Clients, right? So some of the expectations, what a client expects, during a hospital stay, high quality care, clean, safe environments, to be involved in their own care, right? They are the center of that nursing care plan, protection of privacy, assistance when leaving the hospital, help with billing claims. Anybody seen a hospital bill? Crazy. Healthcare is very expensive. And here we go. HIPAA. HIPAA was passed in 1996. It's a guideline for health related facilities and other entities to help provide for patients' privacy. It requires that all covered entities designate a privacy officer. So there are specific standards. Anybody know what the cost is for violating a HIPAA violation? I used to know. It's pretty hefty. It's thousands and thousands of dollars for HIPAA violations. Best thing that you can do is to make sure that you just be very careful. Everybody's heard of, right? Lock your computer when you get up. Don't leave it open for everybody in the world to see. Don't try to go into patients' charts. that are not part of yours. I knew one of my, like years ago, I had a coworker, who violated HIPAA, because they had a famous person at their hospital and she thought it would be a good idea to talk to the press about it. Yeah, so things like that. Client competency. When we things about client competency, legally, they're 18 years or older, a pregnant or married woman, self-supporting minor, so that you're legally in that emancipated minors, or they're competent in the eyes of the law. Clinical competency refers to a client who can identify the problem, understand options for care, make a decision based on sound reason. Why is competency important? What if you have, let's say you have an 18-year-old who comes into the emergency room because they fell off their bicycle and got hit by a car, but they're still talking, they have a fractured leg. But they have but they're autistic, let's say. Can they consent to their own care? Making you think too hard? So that's what it means. That's where we're talking about, right? They're competent in the eyes of the law. So you may have 18-year-olds that are 18, but may have some other mental disabilities that would cause them to be incompetent. Competence is really important when we're looking at signing informed consent, right? So informed consent, right? That's providing our patients with the good, the bad, the ugly, the alternative choices that they have for care, right? Not just, here's a consent form, we need to do open heart surgery, but we're not going to provide you any other, any other information regarding it. So with informed consent, we want to tell them, everything about their disease process, what are the treatment options that are available, what are the expected outcomes, the benefits, any possible side effects, complications, what alternate treatments are available, the prognosis, whether they have the procedure or not have the procedure, and then answer any and all questions that they may have. Biggest part of that is the patient has a right to revoke written permission at any time. Nurses, we can witness informed consent, right? Surgeon comes in, provider comes in, somebody is going to come in and they are going to go through all of this information and we can sign as a witness. If you are in the room and, doctor just left, you get them to sign the consent and they're like, wait, can you explain this to me again? You stop, right? You don't have them sign. We don't provide the information. We're going to go back and we're going to get the provider to come back in and discuss whatever it is that patient didn't understand. Does that make sense? And then the last part is our living will and our advanced or durable power of attorney. So a living will is a legal document. It just tells us, what kind of medical treatment, life-sustaining treatments that we would want if we become seriously or terminally ill, right? So there's a long list of things that we can choose from. Your durable power of attorney, okay, on the other hand, that is where we are assigning a healthcare proxy. And that healthcare proxy right, is going to be the one that is going to make decisions for us should we not be able to make decisions for ourselves. Our DNRs, everybody's heard of DNR before, our do not resuscitate. Right, that's based on the Patient Self-Determination Act, gives the provider the legal permission to write the order. And then we have the wonderful euthanasia. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So we have active and passive euthanasia. Active are actions that speed the process of dying, which are going to result in actively ending a person's life or initiating the dying process. This is morally wrong. It is legally not allowed. It is forbidden by professional nursing or professional organizations. As a matter of fact, the American Nurses Association, the ANA recognizes that assisted suicide and euthanasia continue to be debated. However, nurses do not participate in assisted suicide and euthanasia. Passive euthanasia, basically, we're not doing anything to preserve life. It allows to continue in just continuing a process that causes death. This one is more morally permissible and legally allowed and approved by organizations. And so we do know that, like in certain states, right? Then they have the Death with Dignity Act. I know Oregon was one of the ones, right? The difference with that is the provider is only providing the means, they're not actually performing the act, right? So terminally ill patient, right, goes to their provider under the Death with Dignity Act. There's a process. It's not just, you can't just walk into the doctor's office and say, I want to die. But there is a process, and then the provider will prescribe the lethal medications. The person takes them, goes home, and then they are the ones that decide when to take it, right? And I've heard of this in some cases with people that are terminally ill, that, don't want their kids or loved ones, right, to sit there and suffer with them while they're actively dying. So there's, a variety of different things, but it is a process. It's not just something that you can go and be like, I just want, but we don't provide, we don't assist with any types of euthanasia. Everybody's heard of Dr. Kevorkian, right? And all the trouble that he has gotten into over the years. All right, so I know it's 5:15, so I apologize. We're right on time. Does anybody have any questions? No. All right, so like I said, I am going to get those grades in there for you as soon as I can. So next week is week 5. There's quiz 3. And you have Saunders questions that are due this week as well. As always, if there's any issues, if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me, okay? All right, guys, have a great week.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.